The ballroom lights were a constellation of glass and gold, glittering across the faces of 300 guests. Crystal chandeliers dripped overhead like frozen fireworks, and waiters in white gloves drifted silently between the tables. Every detail, down to the $1,000 roses imported from Holland, was chosen not for beauty, but for spectacle. And I was supposed to be the spectacle. The bride. The Donovan heiress. The daughter of Boston's self-made king. Except I wasn't. I stood near the center of the floor in my gown, fingers knotted tight around the stem of a champagne flute as my father rose from his seat. He didn't bother with his glass. He didn't bother with me. He only reached for the microphone, his diamond cufflinks flashing as if even they couldn't wait to be admired. "Ladies and gentlemen," Robert Donovan began, his voice deep and trained for boardrooms, not blessings. "Before the night continues, there's a truth that must be spoken." The music stopped. The laughter died. The sound of forks against china stilled like a heartbeat held too long. In that pause, I remembered the first time my father had ever silenced a room. I was 7, standing on a chair at a family dinner, eager to read a poem I'd written at school. He cut me off with a wave of his hand and said, "Sit down, Mia. No Donovan wastes breath on childish nonsense." The table had laughed politely, and I had swallowed the sting, promising myself I'd never stand in front of people again unless I was ready to bleed for it. Tonight, it seemed I would bleed. Robert adjusted his tie. Even his smallest movements were sharp enough to wound. "For 28 years, I've carried a burden, one that has stained this family's name. And tonight, I'll no longer protect a lie." 300 eyes swung toward me. I felt them, heavy as stones, pressing against my skin. My husband's hand found mine under the table, steady but tense. "You see," Robert's gaze sliced through me, through the dress, the flowers, the fragile hope of a wedding day. "This woman is not my daughter. She never was." The words shattered in the air like glass against marble. Guests gasped. Phones lifted. Some hands froze mid-clap, mid-sip, mid-smile. My world fractured with the sharp intake of strangers' breath. And in the middle of the rupture, I saw her. Grandma Helen. 85 years old, frail as parchment, sitting with her leather briefcase balanced across her knees. Her eyes, sharp and unflinching, did not move to me like everyone else's. She was watching him, Robert, her own son. And in her expression, I saw something I hadn't seen in anyone else's face that night. Not shock. Not pity. Not fear. Readiness. She had been waiting. Her cane rested against her chair, one liver-spotted hand curled around the handle as if it were not a tool of support, but a weapon yet to be lifted. A strange calm settled in me, even as whispers swelled, even as my father's voice sharpened into cruelty. Because I realized this was not the first act of the play. It was the middle. Somewhere, long before tonight, the curtain had risen and Helen had written a script none of us knew we were performing. But in this moment, all I could do is stand. Stand in the wedding dress that suddenly felt like armor too delicate for battle. Stand in front of the man who had never been a father, only a ruler looking for an heir. Stand in the silence that followed his words, a silence thick with judgment and hunger for scandal. The chandeliers above flickered, just for a second. Enough that the room seemed to inhale. Enough that I knew the night wasn't over, it was only beginning. And somewhere inside that old briefcase, truth was waiting, folded sharp as a blade. I didn't cry. I couldn't. The tears had retreated somewhere deep, leaving only a hollow ache beneath my ribs. Around me, the ballroom pulsed with whispers. Some guests leaned forward, hungry for scandal. Others looked away, embarrassed for me, as if humiliation were contagious. James squeezed my hand again under the table, steady as a heartbeat. He leaned closer, his voice barely a whisper. "Look at me, Mia." Not him. Me. I did. For a second, the chaos shrank, and I was just a kindergarten teacher who'd fallen in love with a man who saw my worth. But the moment snapped as Robert's voice boomed again, dragging me back into the cage of chandeliers and crystal. "She is not of my blood," he declared. "And no bastard will carry the Donovan name into the future." The word bastard hit harder than any slap. Some guests gasped, others smirked. My half-sister, Victoria, shifted in her chair with a gleam that was almost triumphant. She had always been the chosen one, Harvard-polished, dripping in confidence. My father bought her with tuition fees and private tutors. To her, this wasn't tragedy. It was victory. I wanted to scream at them all. Tell them about the nights I ate dinner alone while they toasted champagne in Beacon Hill. About the birthdays my father forgot, the report cards he never read, the way he laughed when I said I wanted to teach children instead of chase contracts. But the words froze in my throat. It was Grandma Helen who saved me from breaking. She hadn't moved yet. Her body seemed fragile, a parchment sketch of the woman who'd once built skyscrapers alongside my grandfather. But her stillness was deceptive. Her eyes were alive, studying, measuring, calculating. I remembered when I was 16, crying in her garden after another family dinner where Victoria had been paraded like a prize horse. Helen had placed that same leather briefcase beside me on the bench. She never opened it, never explained it. She only said, Mia, some truths are heavy. Too heavy for a child to carry. But one day, you'll be strong enough. And when that day comes, you won't lift them alone. Tonight, the weight was here. Margaret, my father's second wife, leaned toward him with her rehearsed mask of sympathy. Her pearls gleamed, her voice soft enough for the microphones to catch. Robert, maybe this isn't the right time. He cut her off with a glare sharp enough to silence her. There's no wrong time for truth. The room was split in two, those who hungered for spectacle and those who sat frozen, unsure if they were witnessing a family tragedy or a corporate coup. Because in the Donovan world, family and empire were the same thing. And I, standing in a gown that suddenly felt too white for the stain of his words, understood something chilling. This wasn't about me. Not really. It never had been. This was about power. And somewhere at the edge of the room, Helen's briefcase gleamed beneath the light, waiting for its moment. The silence cracked like glass under pressure. 300 people held their breath, as if the chandeliers themselves might shatter with the weight of my father's words. I wanted to vanish, to sink into the marble floor, to fold myself into the seams of my gown, to disappear into anything but this spotlight. But humiliation is cruel. It roots you where you stand, forcing you to feel every stare. And then, something shifted. Not in me, not yet. In him. My father raised a folded document above his head. Paper in a ballroom of crystal. It seemed harmless, but the tremor in his voice gave it gravity. Proof, he said. 3 tests. All of them. She doesn't share my blood. The crowd surged with gasps, murmurs, snapping phones. Someone at the far table laughed, a sharp, ugly sound, and it jolted me like an electric shock. For the first time that night, I felt anger burn hotter than shame. Because I remembered. I remembered him missing my college graduation, saying teaching was glorified babysitting. I remembered Victoria waving her Wharton acceptance letter while I clutched my first-class roster. I remembered Margaret telling a florist, loud enough for strangers to hear, Mia isn't technically a full Donovan. I had survived their cruelty before. But this was different. This wasn't just rejection. This was erasure. And then click. The sound of a cane striking marble. Grandma Helen. She rose, slowly but deliberately, each movement an act of defiance against time and frailty. The room tilted toward her. Conversations died mid-breath. Even my father's voice faltered as she began to walk, her cane clicking like a metronome of judgment. Step. Silence. Step. Silence. When she reached him, she didn't look at me. She didn't look at the guests. She only fixed her eyes on the son who had just condemned his daughter. You forgot something, Robert. Her voice was soft, but it carried across the ballroom like a hymn. She extended a manila envelope from beneath her shawl. Its edges were frayed, but its presence was sharp enough to cut through the tension. Robert hesitated. For the first time all night, hesitation cracked his arrogance. He took it. His hands, those hands that had built an empire brick by brick, shook as he unfolded the flap. The room leaned closer. Phones stopped recording. This was no longer entertainment. It was Judgment Day. His face strained of color as his eyes scanned the contents. His lips moved soundlessly, forming words only he could read. And in that instant, the empire shifted. He looked up, and for the first time, he was not the man in control. He was a man exposed. Helen turned, finally meeting my gaze. Her eyes glistened with something that was not pity, not even comfort. It was something fiercer. "Some truths," she said, her voice steady, "wait for their moment. And this, Mia, is yours." The chandeliers above seemed to burn brighter, throwing every shadow into sharp relief. The glass had broken, and there would be no putting it back together. Robert's fingers fumbled as he slid the documents back into the envelope, as though burying them could erase what he'd just seen. His jaw worked soundlessly, rage colliding with disbelief, but his silence was louder than any speech he had given that night. The guests stirred, restless, confused. They weren't here for uncertainty, they were here for certainty, spectacle, blood. The Empire's elite had gathered expecting champagne toasts and polished succession. Instead, they were watching the foundation fracture in real time. Margaret leaned forward, her pearls trembling against the neckline of her gown. "Helen," she hissed, her smile too sharp, "don't do this here. Not in front of everyone." Helen didn't flinch. She leaned on her cane and said, almost casually, "Where better than here?" "Where he chose to disgrace his daughter in front of strangers." The room rippled with gasps. A dozen phones resumed recording. Victoria rose, her voice smooth and cruel. "Enough of this melodrama. Father doesn't owe explanations to sit down." Helen's voice cracked like a whip. It was not the voice of an old woman. It was the voice of a matriarch who had been silent for decades too long. Victoria froze, her cheeks flushing red as she sank back into her chair. I could barely breathe. Every sound, the scrape of cutlery, the click of cameras, the murmur of speculation, felt amplified, as if the world was leaning closer to hear me break. I wasn't sure which was worse, the shame of being disowned, or the crushing weight of expectation building in Helen's stare. Her silence all these years hadn't been passivity, it had been strategy. And now she was asking me to stand in a storm I hadn't prepared for. James leaned toward me again, his voice low but steady. "Mia, whatever this is, you're not alone. Not anymore." The words anchored me. But they also terrified me. Because if Helen was truly ready to reveal everything she'd hidden in that briefcase, it meant my life, the quiet classrooms, the safety of crayons and storybooks, was about to be burned down and rebuilt into something unrecognizable. Robert slammed the microphone stand, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "This is slander," he barked, his mask of control cracking. "Old woman, you don't know what you're talking about." Helen didn't even blink. She gestured with her hand, small and deliberate. "James," she said, her voice steady, "fetch the briefcase." My heart stuttered. The briefcase. The room tilted as James rose, crossing the floor under the weight of hundreds of eyes. When he disappeared through the side door toward my suite, whispers exploded around the room like a hive disturbed. Executives muttered to each other, some furiously typing into their phones. The board members shifted uneasily, their faces tight with the dawning awareness that this wasn't family drama anymore, it was corporate warfare. Robert pointed a shaking hand at Helen. "You've plotted against me for years. You've never accepted me." "Accepted you?" Helen's laugh was soft, brittle, but laced with venom. "I made you, Robert. And tonight, I will unmake you." The chandeliers above seemed to shiver. James reappeared, the leather briefcase in his hands. He placed it on the head table with reverence, as though setting down a sacred text. The brass clasps gleamed under the candlelight. Helen rested her hand atop it. The ballroom fell into absolute silence. And in that stillness, I realized the truth. My father had tried to destroy me with words. But what was inside that briefcase had the power to destroy him, with proof. Helen's fingers unclasped the briefcase, with a sound so small it should have been insignificant. Yet, in the silence of the ballroom, it was thunder. The lid opened, and neatly stacked folders gleamed under the chandelier light. Not chaos. Not scraps. Evidence, ordered, labeled, undeniable. Helen lifted the first document, her voice calm, deliberate, like a surgeon preparing for incision. Donovan Industries was not yours to claim, Robert. It was mine and William's. Co-founders. Equal partners. And when William died, the shares didn't vanish into your pocket. They were placed in trust. A murmur surged through the crowd. Executives craned their necks, board members leaned forward, their eyes scanning seals and signatures. The empire that Robert had worn like a crown for 3 decades suddenly had cracks running straight through it. He snatched the papers from her hand, his voice ragged. This doesn't change anything. I built this company. No, Helen's eyes, sharp as glass, cut him down. You managed it. Badly. And the trust makes the terms very clear. Any act of disgrace, fraud, or cruelty forfeits leadership. Her cane tapped once against the marble floor. Tonight, you called your own daughter a bastard in front of 300 witnesses. That alone triggers removal. The weight of her words hit harder than any gavel. Robert's face reddened, veins rising like rope along his neck. She is not my daughter. Helen didn't flinch. She reached for another folder. Then perhaps you'll recognize your own signature. She held aloft a birth certificate, the ink faded, but the name undeniable, Robert William Donovan. Father. Gasps cut through the air. And then another file. Here is the DNA test you so proudly waved. Falsified. The lab shut down for fabricating results to help men like you dodge responsibility. I have sworn affidavits, signed under penalty of perjury, proving you paid for a lie. The sound in the ballroom shifted, gasps replaced by outrage, whispers turning into sharp, clipped sentences. Phones filmed, fingers typed, reputations collapsed in real time. Robert staggered back as if struck. No, this isn't. Helen's hand rose, silencing him. And finally, she revealed a thin medical folder. The Donovan kidney marker. A condition that has run in this family for generations. You have it. William had it. And so does Mia. Science doesn't lie, Robert. But you did. For 28 years. The document slipped from her hand, drifting down like a feather, landing at his polished shoes. The room exhaled in unison. 300 people staring not at me anymore, but at him, the titan reduced to a fraud, a liar, a father who had chosen cruelty over truth. James's hand gripped mine. His voice was steady, but his eyes brimmed with fire. It's over, Mia. He can't take anything from you anymore. Helen's gaze locked on me, not him. No, James. It's not over. It's only beginning. She turned back to the board members, her voice like iron beneath velvet. Per the trust, the company belongs to the eldest grandchild with integrity intact. Robert forfeited his claim the moment he opened his mouth tonight. Victoria is disqualified. Which leaves, her hand gestured toward me. The chandeliers above flared, as if the room itself had chosen sides. I froze, every eye staring into me, every secret of my bloodline hanging in the air. My father had tried to strip me of identity. Now, in front of everyone, I was being handed something far heavier. The ballroom did not erupt into applause. Not yet. Silence held, stretched taut, like the air before a storm breaks. Every guest seemed to wait for me to move, to speak, to claim or to refuse what had just been placed in my hands. I stared at the stack of documents, at the briefcase that had been a shadow at every family dinner, and for the first time I understood what it really was, not just evidence. It was a weapon. My grandmother had carried it like a soldier carries a blade, waiting for the moment when truth could cut clean through lies. And now that blade was mine. Robert sagged into his chair, his empire collapsing not with fire but with paper. Margaret's pearls trembled against her throat, her eyes darting toward exits that no longer offered escape. Victoria's glass of champagne sat untouched, the bubbles long gone flat, her ambitions dissolving with them. Helen's gaze never left me. Her voice, soft but unwavering, filled the hall. Mia, leadership is not about bloodlines. It's about what you do when the world demands you stand. I wanted to protest. I wanted to say I wasn't ready, that I was a teacher, not a titan of glass towers and boardrooms. But deep down, I knew she wasn't asking me to choose between the two. She was telling me I already was both. James whispered, "Whatever you decide, I'll stand with you." His hand squeezed mine, not guiding, not pushing, just steady. So I rose. Slowly, the silk of my gown rustling like a tide pulling back from shore. "I will never run this empire the way my father did," I said, my voice carrying through the chandeliers, through the stunned silence. "Because I don't believe in empires. I believe in building people. In lifting those the world overlooks. That's who I am, and that's who I'll remain." Somewhere, someone began to clap. Tentative at first, then stronger, spreading like fire. It wasn't the polite applause reserved for business victories. It was human, raw, resonant. Helen closed her eyes briefly, as if finally setting down a burden she had carried alone for too long. When she opened them, there was pride shining there, fierce and unyielding. Robert didn't look at me again. His crown of arrogance had already crumbled, and all that remained was a man small enough to be forgotten. But I wouldn't forget. Not his cruelty. Not Helen's patience. Not the moment I almost broke and instead chose to stand. The music resumed soft, tentative, the strings of the quartet trembling into life. James pulled me gently onto the dance floor. And there, beneath the chandeliers that had witnessed both my undoing and my rise, we took our first steps as husband and wife. I rested my head against his shoulder, eyes closing, breath steadying. Around me, the crowd blurred into shadows and candlelight. But one truth rang clear.